All right. Well, thanks everybody, and welcome to our conversation today. We're pretty excited to have this dialogue, be able to talk through, the potential changes that we'd be looking at in a Biden administration to OSHA. This is a big topic, and we've got a lot of good thoughts around it, especially with Doug's expertise, which we'll get into here in a minute. But thanks for taking some time. I know everybody's got a busy schedule. We really want this to be interactive, collaborative. We want to get some engagement from the group. But it isn't designed to be a political conversation, nor are we attorneys giving legal advice or anything like that. This is just, our thoughts on what we can expect in the new administration, with kind of Doug's background and experience going through multiple administrations as well. And so with that, I would like to introduce the folks we've got on the call that are going to kind of have this discussion. So first, we've got Andy Bassett, president of Ellerbrock-Norris, that's going to kind of help walk through this discussion. I'm Elliots Bassett with Ellerbrock-Norris, our chief operating officer. And we have Doug Fletcher, president of Fletcher Safety Consulting, host of the What's the Hazard podcast, and our resident subject matter expert on all things safety and OSHA. And so welcome, guys. I'm excited for this topic. And this topic is brought to you by the Encore Safety Network as well. I know that we have several people that are members of the Encore Safety Network on the call, and several that are not. So this is brought to you by the network, and we just want to make sure that we're getting this type of information out to not only members, but anybody that is interested and is in a safety capacity. So with that, Doug, let's jump in. I might have you give kind of some background, your experience, your resume, if you will, to kind of give everybody an idea of your experience level and kind of knowledge in talking about this topic.
Of course. Well, good morning, everybody. Elliot, thanks a lot. Andy, thanks for setting this up. And Alex, thanks for helping me get into the technical part of this. I appreciate it. It is good to see the names. I see a few faces and I see a lot of familiar names. Great to see everyone. I hope you're all doing well. It's very exciting to actually have a meeting of sorts. And so I've been looking forward to it. Most of you know, I spent quite a bit of time with OSHA. I worked for OSHA here in Nebraska for 17 years. I started in 1996. I came from the Department of Defense, actually, so I've been a Fed I was a Fed for quite a long time. Under the Clinton administration, actually. So I started under President Clinton, worked through the Bush administration, and then I worked through the Obama administration, and I separated from OSHA at the end of 2013, actually, which was still President Obama administration. So I had the opportunity to work in 2 Democratic administrations, 1 Republican administration, and they were, it was kind of one in between of the other 2. So it was a really interesting experience.
Absolutely. And then what have you been doing for the last 7 years?
Since I separated from OSHA, and we can talk a little bit about why I separated from OSHA. It has something to do with the conversation, frankly, but I've just been working independently. I'm self-employed. I just help people with working safely, things like that. We've been doing a lot of industrial hygiene monitoring of late. It's that time of year. Just helping people do the right thing. So it's great. It's great. I love it.
Absolutely. Well, and I just asked that. I mean, a lot, like you mentioned, a lot of people on the call know you and are familiar with you, but I just think it's important to highlight that you've still been in and working with companies around safety, dealing with OSHA over the last 7 years, and are still very familiar with the OSHA guys in Omaha and beyond. And so a very good experience around this topic. And so I think that leads kind of into my first maybe overall question, Doug, is just in general, with your experience over the years, how has a change in presidency, particularly when a change in party affiliation happens, Democrat to Republican or vice versa, how has that impacted OSHA's enforcement and just the general feeling within OSHA?
That is a really interesting question. And when I first went to work for OSHA, I assumed that, safety was safety, and that's what we did, and that's how it would remain. And irrespective of the party or the administration, we would be out there making sure workplaces was safe. And I suppose that was somewhat naive. In retrospect, it was very naive, but the reality is OSHA as a regulatory agency is a very political entity. It's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this since we've decided to have this conversation. And, the people that work for OSHA, the career people that work for OSHA, much like my, civil servants, they tend to be they have a certain inertia. And, they are safety professionals typically. Some of them are administrators, but most of them are safety professionals. And I think they view safety the same way I did. It shouldn't really change. But the reality is, at the top, the assistant secretary for OSHA, the deputy assistant secretaries for OSHA, the appointees, tend to be very political, and they tend to drive an agenda that is congruent with the thoughts of the party in control. And that has a way of infiltrating down into the field. Obviously, it starts at the top with an agenda, and it just kind of infiltrates, it permeates down into the field. So it's kind of an evolution of sorts. I think that if we do see a change in administration in January, which seems to be likely, there are certain things that I think we can expect immediately. But the real change, the attitudinal change, which is driven from the top down, is a little bit more slow to come around. So there will be some regulatory changes, I anticipate. There will be some other policy changes that I expect to see fairly soon in that first 100 days. But the attitudes out in the field, the compliance officers themselves, the team leaders in the area offices, that takes a little while for that attitude to permeate down into the field. So I think we're talking about, probably 12 months or so by the time we really feel the change in administration in that respect. So it's very interesting. But like I said, when I came, I didn't know any different. When I was working for President Clinton, I did not work for him directly. When I was working under the Clinton administration, I didn't realize that it was political. That's just what I knew. But when President Bush came into office, things changed dramatically, and I was like, whoa, that's kind of interesting. And all of a sudden, the agency was professing itself to be kinder and gentler, and we were doing more of those voluntary compliance programs. We were doing partnerships and alliances, and VPP, for example, the Voluntary Protection Program, really thrived under the Bush administration. And so that was interesting to me. And then when President Obama became, the executive, things swung back so dramatically. In fact, I mean, if you can envision a pendulum, from Clinton to Bush, the pendulum kind of just reached the same amplitude, but then on the backstroke from Bush to Obama, the pendulum really swung, the full path. I mean, it really was amplified under the Obama administration. They were very committed to enforcement. If you recall, the assistant secretary under President Obama was Dr. David Michaels. He's an academic. He came out of academia and then became a bureaucrat. And so if you can imagine anything worse than an academic bureaucrat, I'm not quite sure that, and I guess this is not intended to be my opinion necessarily, but he was the assistant secretary who professed that compliance by shaming people into compliance was an appropriate methodology, which was something that me personally, I took a little bit of offense to. And so when I left the agency at the end of 2013, I was working for Dr. Michaels, and it was under the Obama administration. My next job was likely to be the area director in Nebraska. At that time, I was the assistant area director in Nebraska, and I just philosophically didn't really embrace that. And so that was the time for me to separate. So I left the agency voluntarily at that point.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting, which I know we'll get into specifics that we can do to prepare for some of the changes. But just the attitudinal, I think is how you put it, of changes between different administrations and how that impacts the agency's enforcement, I think is just a very intriguing, and it's predictable in a lot of regards. Would
It
you
is
agree with that?
I would agree. It's very predictable. It has become very, it is a very established pattern. And so I think President-elect Biden has already shown himself to be, certainly in the mold of President Obama. He seems to be interacting with a number of former Obama executives. For example, I see some familiar names. I've been doing a lot of reading, and none of what I'm talking about is other than my opinion, is original. There's quite a bit of information published already by the various law firms that are involved in labor law. They're already publishing their perspective on what will change. But you see names like, Dr. Michaels has actually been appointed to the COVID task force as their workplace safety and health representative, which I think is very telling. There is a name that floats around, Debbie Berkowitz. She was the chief of staff to Dr. Michaels under the Obama administration. She came from organized labor. She was a higher up safety and health official with the AFL-CIO, and she was the one that came to Omaha back while I was in the Omaha area office. Right after the administration had taken over, Dr. Michaels had been confirmed as the assistant secretary. Ms. Berkowitz had been selected for chief of staff position to Dr. Michaels, and she came out to the area office and told us, as a field office, she said, we're not really fond of this kinder, gentler approach to regulatory enforcement. We intend to ramp up enforcement, the number of inspections, the number of inspectors. We intend to do away with a number of the voluntary compliance programs. They were not in favor of VPP. You saw the VPP program take a significant dip during the Obama, and so it's not really a judgment necessarily. It's just an observation that I think it is safe to assume that we will see an increase in inspection activity and a change in the attitude toward inspection activity eventually. I think that's what will be promoted from the national office. They like an aggressive posture in enforcement. They like to see a little bit higher penalties, more citations being written, higher penalties being issued. Again, some people are convinced that that's what OSHA's role is, that OSHA should be a hammer. Pardon me, that's appropriate. And so you would find a lot of career OSHA people who agree with that. That's what they believe OSHA is supposed to be. And so, again, it's not a judgment. I mean, it's just an observation, but I think we can expect that. They've already talked about filling vacancies. There have been a number of vacancies during the Trump administration. Some of the assistant secretary, the deputy positions and things have gone unfilled. We currently don't have an assistant secretary for OSHA. We never did under the Trump administration. The agency was run by a political appointee that was a deputy assistant secretary. And I think that's what we will see immediately under the Biden administration. We will see a deputy assistant secretary appointed, a political appointee, probably someone from organized labor or something like that, who will guide the agency until an assistant secretary can be nominated and confirmed. And there is a confirmation requirement for that position. So in the meantime, they tend to do things through those political appointees, which is perfectly legitimate. That's how it's always done. So we can talk about some of the things that I think will change if that's what you would like to do. But
yeah, I think, Doug, I was going to maybe ask a question from the collective group, because if we think about the audience here, it's a lot of small business in the heartland of America, right? And you mentioned staying on the topic of predictability. Since you experienced directly, engaged with OSHA, the Bush to Obama transition, and you saw what small business experienced, what they had to go through, the planning they needed to do, can we connect that then? If we assume, and maybe it's unfair to assume, you can comment on this too, but if we assume that Biden will be somewhat similar in a transition this time around, maybe walk through what it is that small businesses should start to think about now that they can plan, because I know you mentioned there's maybe a 12-month lag, but I think that's a lot of what's on people's mind is I don't know what I should be doing right now or what I should be expecting, but Doug is probably a great resource to give me some things to think about because he's been there directly before. So However you would answer that question, I'm really curious for the collective audience here.
Well, that is a great question, and it is interesting. I think everyone is aware that under the Obama administration, the agency they changed the penalty structure. Okay, so first of all, throughout the Clinton and Bush administrations, we had worked under a penalty structure that had been established back when the act was written. It was a $7,000 maximum statutory penalty for a serious violation and a $70,000 maximum statutory penalty for one of the willful or repeat violations. And then, they are basically adjusted based on a number of different factors from that maximum standpoint. Well, we saw probably in 2015, I would imagine, a change in that penalty structure. So now the OSHA penalty structure is following the Consumer Price Index, and they increased penalties so that now a serious violation is about $13,600, and the willful and repeat violations can have a statutory maximum of $136,000, significantly higher, and those are going to increase based on that Consumer Price Index variability a little bit every year going forward. So the penalty amounts will continue to increase, which is staggering. The thought of a small business getting a penalty for $13,000, let alone $136,000, is really terrifying, Frank. I mean, I'm a small businessman, and man, if they cited me $13,000, I would be in a tough situation. So I think to some degree that is what is most concerning. I think there is no doubt that we will see an increase in staffing. One of the things that has been allowed to happen under the Trump administration is that, at least in the Omaha area office, the number of compliance officers has decreased just by attrition. A full complement of compliance officers for the state of Nebraska is 10. And I think up until about a few months ago, the area office was functioning with 4 compliance officers. They just didn't fill those positions. Now I think in Nebraska we have 8 compliance officers, and I would assume that we will very quickly after the first of the year, we will fill those other positions. So that's one thing I think we can expect, is we will see a full complement of compliance officers in the area office, which means, of course, that we will see more inspection activity. They will use, the addition of compliance officers to increase inspection activity. And, an average year for the Omaha area office is probably around 400 inspections a year. I mean, that's not a huge number when you think about the number of businesses and the number of construction sites. The regulated community in Nebraska is fairly large, and 400 inspections a year is not a huge number. But Congress has the ability to push that number through the appropriations process. They can push that number higher, and so once we have a full complement of compliance officers again, I think you could expect maybe a 20% increase, maybe 500 is the number, something like that. But I think those things are easily forecasted. I think we can expect that to happen.
Yeah, that's I imagined that was going to be kind of your response. So maybe a follow-up question to the potential for increased inspections is, are there certain industries that you would suggest? I mean, outside of the obvious maybe, but are there particular industries that maybe you think that inspection activity is probably most likely to increase in those industries? Or maybe just walk through, because we have a wide variety of different businesses on this call, but maybe kind of an industry specific transition conversation.
There is, without question. And it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So Nebraska is a separate jurisdiction as far as OSHA is concerned. And interestingly, there is the unprogrammed work that won't change. That OSHA will always investigate imminent danger reports. They will investigate fatalities. They will investigate, the rapid response investigations, amputations, hospitalizations, loss of an eye. Those unprogrammed activities will continue, and those are their highest priority. The programmed work is what you're referring to. How do they select businesses to go visit to conduct inspections? And they have a number of programs. And if you want detail about the programs that are being administered here in Nebraska, all of the programs they administer, they have to go through proposal and review. I used to write the programs for Nebraska. They go through a legal review, and then they get posted on the website. And so if you were to go to the Google and you just Googled in local emphasis programs, LEP is the acronym, local emphasis programs, it would take you to the web page where the agency lists all of the local emphasis programs, and you can select Region 7, the Omaha area office is in Region 7 of OSHA, and you would actually be able to pull up the documentation and review those to see if in fact they might apply to your operation. But they do run the program, we refer to it as site-specific targeting, and this is the program that is utilizing that electronic data that some of you are submitting to OSHA. So back in 2016, I believe, OSHA developed this electronic reporting requirement. So every March 2nd, if you have more than 20 people at a location, 20 or more people at a location, I should be specific, then you have to submit this electronic injury and illness data from the previous year, and that information is used to develop the targeting lists for site-specific targeting. They are taking your injury and illness data. So I think they are currently running from 2018 data. So if you had a bad year in 2018 and you submit information electronically, there is a higher likelihood that you're going to be on a list for inspection in Nebraska and any jurisdiction. They do that in every jurisdiction. The other things are, they're not injury and illness rate specific. They are, as you said, Andy, they're either industry specific or they are hazard specific. So in Nebraska, they are running programs in the meat processing industry, of course, in the grain handling industry, of course, but they also run programs based on hazard like silica. So if your industry works with silica, there is a potential that you will be on an inspection list. Hexavalent chromium, if you work with stainless steel or you do something like that, there is a potential that you are going to be on those lists. They have lists that are based on construction. So if they run a program called falls, overhead power lines, and scaffolds, which is basically OSHA's mechanism for getting onto construction sites. So if you're in the construction sector, typically what OSHA will use is just visualization. They will drive by a construction site, either by referral, someone calls it in and refers it to OSHA, or even by chance, they might be traveling from point A to point B and see a construction site. If there are any fall hazards present, if there are scaffolds on the project, or if there are overhead power lines on the project, they can put you on a list or they can initiate an inspection right at that moment. That gives them, they believe they have the legal right to be able to initiate an inspection based on seeing one of those three hazards. And so all of the programmed inspections are all driven by written documentation that we have access to. And so it would be prudent to go take a look at that. Google LEPs, OSHA LEPs, go to Region 7. They are listed by state, so Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa. If you work in any of those or all of those states, you can see the programs that they are administering right now. And those change every year. They have to be updated annually. So it is probably worth taking a look at, but that's a great point. Now, having said that, I think it's very obvious that under a Biden administration, we will have an emergency temporary standard for COVID-19. The Trump administration has taken a beating by the OSHA opponents that they're not doing enough for COVID-19. And so they can implement an emergency temporary standard where they believe there is imminent danger to the workforce for 6 months. And I think that we will see that. We already have emergency temporary standards in Virginia, California, and I believe one other state, maybe Oregon or perhaps Washington. They've already initiated these and they are administering these. And I think that we are going to see an emergency temporary standard for COVID, which means that depending on the risk category your company falls in, based on the activities that you do and the likelihood of exposure to a COVID infected person, you will be following the CDC guidelines. Those won't be guidelines any longer. Those will be requirements. And so I do expect that to change probably right away. I think that's something that they will do very quickly after the change.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We are seeing at least one question that's come in, so thank you for that. We'll make sure to get that addressed here, definitely in our Q&A. But Doug, maybe talk through any other, I mean, what other things are on the top of your mind as potential changes that, you expect to see initially, like that, the emergency temporary standard around COVID?
You bet. There are a few things, and again, believe me, this is information that I have just garnered through my own research and reading. But based on my experience, I would agree that they are likely. Number one is, let me refer to my notes. So back in 2016, most of you will recall that OSHA, they basically rolled out this anti-discrimination change to the record keeping standard. Okay, so OSHA there is a portion of OSHA that is concerned about retaliation, that employers will retaliate against employees for having injuries or for reporting injuries, things of that nature. And so back in 2016, as part of the record keeping requirement, they rolled out, and so you will recall it manifested itself like we're not going to be able to incentivize not having injuries anymore. People that had incentive programs, that used injuries and illnesses as a critical indicator, had to change their incentive programs. No longer could you have an incentive program that said, okay, you get a year-end bonus because you didn't get injured this year, or the boss gets a year-end bonus because we didn't have any injuries or we were below our target number. And OSHA came out and said they did not like that because they believed that quashed reporting, that discouraged people from an open, honest reporting. Well, the Trump administration basically just said, we're not doing that, screw that. So we didn't hear anything about that. It basically went away, and they said, do whatever you want. And so people kind of let up on those changes. They kind of did whatever they wanted from an incentive program. I can almost assure you that the requirements didn't change, but the attitude toward enforcement changed. And so under the Trump administration, the anti-retaliation elements of that just kind of went by the wayside. I expect we will see that again, that OSHA will be looking at those discrimination practices as they view them. So if you do have incentive programs, I think we might want to revisit that. This also impacted drug testing, as you might recall. OSHA they always kind of wanted us to do just post-incident drug testing. But OSHA's position was that if you just did blanket across the board, everybody that has an incident gets drug tested. If that was your approach, OSHA also felt like that would quash reporting. People aren't going to come forward and reveal an incident if they're concerned about possibly being drug tested. So OSHA's position was, let's use reasonable suspicion test. If you have a reason to believe that someone was under the influence, then we drug test them, but not across the board, because that might quash people from reporting. And so again, under the Trump administration, we didn't really deal with that. They didn't really pursue that. But again, that is still on the books. And so I think it's safe to say that we will see a return to those things.
Hey,
OSHA,
Doug, I want to ask a question specific on that, just because we get this question a lot, and we got it a lot a handful of years ago around those two topics, incentive and then the drug testing. One thing that I felt was experienced was not a lot of really good clarity and communication around the position, right, of the new administration to those rules and regulations that had been established prior. So these are two, again, topics that become really common we hear about. I'm guessing a lot of people on this call are curious about both. What do you expect if, in fact, those are going to potentially kind of revisit, ramp up? How do you expect communication to be from OSHA? Because again, my experience was it wasn't great prior.
Yeah, I would agree. I do expect them to ramp those things back up, probably within the first year. Those are things that are already in the books, so those are easy to ramp back up. There was some really good literature back in 2016 from OSHA. It was written by a gentleman that used to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Richard Fairfax. And you see his name on a lot of OSHA publications on letters of interpretation. Richard Fairfax put out a document specifically about these anti-discrimination issues. You could probably just Google Richard Fairfax Anti-Discrimination and find the memorandum from OSHA, and he described what basically the agency's position on how these things were going to be interpreted and applied. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't just, reuse that same language. It might come from someone else. It might come from a current deputy or the new deputy perhaps, but I would assume they would just use that same language because it was about all we had for guidance, frankly, Andy. I would agree with you that it wasn't very clearly communicated, but I think the take-home message was we don't want to be incentivizing not having injuries anymore because that seemed to displease the agency. And just blanket drug testing also seemed to be something that they were just not comfortable with. And so my suggestion would be that they will probably use that same language, and we have access to that. That's still public domain. I'm sure we can go in and find that and maybe distribute that to if nothing else, maybe we can distribute that as a link perhaps or something that they can have access to, or they are certainly capable of Googling it themselves, Richard Fairfax, anti-discrimination. But it was the guidance document that we worked from, frankly. I do have one other interesting just point of information, but it will have some impact on what happens in Region 7. I'm assuming everyone on the call is a Region 7 person, if not a Nebraska person. Some of you know Bonita Winningham. Bonita Winningham was a former colleague of mine. I worked for Bonita for probably 15 of the 17 years that I was with OSHA. She is currently the Deputy Regional Administrator for Region 7. She's down in Kansas City. She was the area director in Omaha for a number of years after Ben Bear retired, and she was my boss for a number of years. She is retiring at the end of December. So Bonita has been a fixture in Nebraska and Region 7 for 25 years. And much of what we see out in the field is a result of her influence. She is the person who has driven the attitudes in Region 7 for many, many years. And she and I are friends. I'm not saying that, to be disrespectful. We didn't always agree on everything, certainly. But she is leaving at the end of December. She's retiring. If you know Bonita, you may want to reach out to her and communicate with her. But her absence is going to be interesting to see. I don't know who they will replace her with. Someone internal, one of the assistant regional administrators will get promoted into that deputy position. But there is nobody else like Bonita in this region. And so I think that will have an impact. Frankly, it'll be interesting to see how her absence, how that void is filled. I'm really interested to see that.
Yeah, that will be interesting for sure. Any other kind of changes that you see coming initially?
Yeah, man, I have a couple other things, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
One other thing that I think that we will see immediately, because it's already on the books, it was just something that the Trump administration just tended not to focus heavily on. But if you recall, the electronic reporting, most of you will recall when this electronic reporting requirement rolled out. It was actually two pieces. There was the, if you are a business, if at your location you have between 20 and 249 employees, so 20 to 249 employees at a location, you are required to report electronically, once a year. So March 2nd, I think, is the deadline for this coming year. Basically, the information that you would capture in your 300A, your injury and illness summary form. So all of those bottom line totals from your 300 log, you were basically inputting into this electronic database. But the second part of that was if you were a company 250 or greater at any location, not company-wide, but at a location, so this is a big facility, 250 or greater, you are required to submit your 300A, your 300 log, and all of your 301s, your first reports. I mean, it seemed like, holy shit, what are they talking about? But I mean, can you imagine a meatpacking facility, maybe the size of Tyson, trying to submit 301s? I mean, they must generate 1,000 301s every year. But I'm tempted to believe that we will be revisiting that as well, because if you are an agency that believes shaming companies into compliance is the appropriate methodology, you are going to want to be able to post all that information, put it up. I mean, right now, the 300A information, for those of you that are not aware, that the 300A information that you're submitting every spring is posted. You can go online and see every company's submission. I do that periodically just to make sure my clients are doing all right. You know, I mean, they submit that information, it's available, and I think that we will see the agency will probably drive us back into that mode as well. So if you're a large company, I think there is a likelihood that you will be required to submit all of that information. General duty clause. One of the things that the agency has been criticized for is not issuing more general duty clause citations with regard to COVID. You know, there have been a lot of what we refer to as hazard alert letters. They are basically just notifications. It's not a citation. There's no penalty, but it's just a notification letter. Hey, you need to do better. Those are easy, and the agency the area office tends to write a lot of these hazard alert letters. We call them HALs. But they've been criticized for not writing more 5A1 citations, specifically to companies that are not following the CDC guidelines well. And I would expect that we will see, you know, again, this is the attitudinal push down, but I think there will be pressure from the national office put on the regional offices to issue more 5A1 citations, just like significant cases. You know, the pressure to issue significant cases, those high dollar cases, comes from above. And so when I was the acting area director in Omaha, I would get a phone call once a week from the regional administrator telling me what we needed more of. You know, Doug, you need more citations. Doug, you need higher penalties. Doug, we need more significant cases. Doug, we need this, or I mean, I would get that phone call every Monday morning instructing me what, you know, the authorities, what they wanted. And then I would go into the meeting with my guys and I say, guys, we need more citations. We need higher penalties. We need a SIG case this week or whatever. And, you know, well, everybody uses metrics to gauge their performance, and those are the metrics that OSHA uses. Those are the metrics that Congress demands of OSHA. And so when the boss comes in and says, I need more citations, I can assure you as a compliance officer that I can find more citations. Okay. If I come into your facility and I like you and you're treating me professionally and I can tell that you're trying to do the best you can, I have the latitude to probably just discuss a few things with you, but not cite you for them. You know, I mean, that's the latitude that a compliance officer earns after doing this for a while. But when there's pressure on me, my performance is being evaluated based on this, and the boss is pressuring me to issue more citations. I can issue more citations. That's not a problem. It's very subjective. And so a lot of it is driven by that top-down pressure. And so, like I said, I think there are things that the agency can change right away, but I also think that there are things that will evolve after we've had that administration in place for a while, and that's just how the guys do their work. You know, that's what they are allowed to do out in the workplace. So interesting.
Yeah, that is absolutely. Well, we kind of wanted to make sure we left some time for Q&A, but we also wanted to open it up for anyone that has had experiences with OSHA, maybe an inspection or working with a compliance officer, or just really any experiences in general that maybe you have seen some changes over the years when we changed administrations, or just in the recent past, what those experiences have been. So feel free to unmute if you want to talk through those, post something in the chat box, but we'll also open it up to questions. So please throw those in the chat box or unmute and ask. We did have one come in kind of specific, Doug, but to get your perspective on, to kind of start off the Q&A, when it comes specifically to staffing agencies, what, can they do or what can they expect that might be different than we've talked about protect themselves or their candidates when they're putting them on with an employer at a factory, construction site, etc.?
Wow, that is a really good question. OSHA's position has historically has evolved into this. A temporary worker under the day-to-day control of a host employer is essentially an employee of that host for the purposes of safety and health practices, record keeping, things like that. But the temporary agency is expected to provide a certain level of training and preparation for their clients, their employees, before they go to the host. And so there have been a number of circumstances that I was involved in, and probably since I left, where there was some question as to whether the temporary agency had done their due diligence, had done their part. So the host is responsible for doing a certain amount of training, the site-specific work, but the temporary agency is also responsible for doing certain things, like maybe general hazard communication training. This is a safety data sheet. This is a label. This is the information that you will find on those documents. And there is a document, one of them that is used frequently and referenced frequently on the OSHA website. It's a compliance directive. So it's a CPL, okay? It's the acronym is CPL, Charlie, Puma, Lima. That I was obviously not in the military. So CPL, it's the CPL for hazard communication. So we're all familiar with hazard communication and the regulation, but there is a compliance directive for hazard communication that gives a really lengthy and detailed description of what temporary agencies are responsible for, specifically with regard to hazard communication, but generally that expands out to everything that the temp agency would be responsible for. So if you are a temp agency and you are just sending people out and you have not done anything to prepare them from a safety standpoint, maybe that's something that you discuss with the host and you agree, we're going to cover this, you're going to cover that. I would think that would be an appropriate conversation to have with the host that you're sending stuff. Maybe they want them to be prepared to drive a forklift, and then on site they will do certain site specific training. But if you're not doing anything like that, I think you are vulnerable to citation, because there is an expectation that temp agencies participate in that preparation.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that feedback, Doug. So anybody else out there with questions? None are being posted in the chat box, but
let me just say two things. In preparation for the new administration, most of you, if you are on this call, I assume you are already actively engaged in your workplace safety and health practices. So I commend you for that. The people that need this conversation aren't on the call typically, but just make sure that I have always said that, man, we don't want to focus on compliance. We just want to focus on working safely, right? We want to make sure that we are identifying hazards, we are correcting hazards, but I'm going to roll that back a little bit and say we need to be focused on compliance as well, because under the new administration, there will be a heavy emphasis on compliance. It's not what we should be focusing on necessarily, but it is a piece of it. And so if you are if your organizational approach is find hazards and fix hazards, and that is what I recommend, but we also need to make sure that we are compliant. So that means the conditions in your facility are compliant, your written programs are compliant with OSHA specs, your training is compliant, all of that regulatory stuff that is important that we need to be paying attention to. So I would suggest that if you do internal audits, if you are a company that does internal audits, make sure you're doing those. If you use an insurance person to do that for you, make sure you're doing that. If you use the OSHA consultation group out of Lincoln, Jim Cover and his consultants, I would make sure to get on their list, because they are swamped right now. So you need to get on that list. And if you use a third party, and again, if you use a group, somebody like me or some of the other consultants that are out there, I would have them in over the next 12 months just to make sure that our house is in order. I think that will be important. I think we do need to reconsider some of those policies, the drug testing, incentives. I'm not suggesting that you have to have that done by January 22nd or whenever the administration is scheduled to change, but it needs something that you probably need to be thinking about. And then the last thing I would suggest, and this is something that Elliot and Andy we have talked about perhaps doing as another session, is developing a contingency strategy for if and when OSHA shows up. Do you have a policy in place? Do you have a checklist, a contingency? Do you know how to deal with OSHA if they come on site? That is really important. Most of you have that already. You've already discussed that. You've considered it. But if you haven't done that, you need to sit down with your leaders and discuss how you intend to address an OSHA inspection if you get one.
Doug, so that's actually a great segue. We're starting to get questions, so maybe we can almost look at this as rapid fire, quick hit answers, so that we can get as many people to ask questions as possible here.
I'll go in reverse. Answer a question quickly. Is that what you just said?
Reading between the lines, Doug. You got a rapid fire here.
Okay, man.
I'll go in reverse order because I think it's a segue from what you just said. But Brandon asks, what are 3 tips, do's and don'ts, if an OSHA inspector does a surprise visit to the facility that you could offer up? So rapid fire, what are the 3 things that come to mind?
Well, certainly, be prepared. So have a checklist in place, when they come in and introduce themselves. Somebody needs to initiate your inspection protocol. There'll be notifications you need to make. You need to notify certain people. You need to assemble a certain group, and you need to take that compliance officer and set them somewhere harmless for the hour that you are afforded to prepare for the inspection. So you have up to an hour to get yourself organized. And I would take that compliance officer, I would treat them professionally, I would put them in a little conference room or someplace harmless and just get them a cup of coffee and just let them know that you are making the appropriate calls. But you need that checklist in place so that it doesn't come apart when they show up. It gets very anxious when they are there asking for stuff. Make sure you know who's going to be communicating with the OSHA person, and then just know how you plan on providing them the information that they're going to ask for.
Look at that. You can provide value in a quick hit fashion. You're the man.
That was 30 seconds, man.
That's right. All right. So we had another, I don't want to miss a question. Jack had asked a question, which I anticipated maybe we'd start to get some around kind of CDC and COVID-19 type of stuff. Jack says, can you talk more on the CDC guidelines that OSHA is currently involved in or looking to get involved in? So quick hit there.
This is difficult to be quick on, but they have published documentation. So back in May, OSHA actually changed their approach to COVID enforcement. And those documents are available on the website. If you have difficulty locating them, let me know. I can help you find them. We can post them, whatever you want to do. But basically, they are categorizing workplaces based on risk. So they have a very high risk category, which would be healthcare facilities that are handling COVID patients, nursing homes that are handling COVID patients. Those facilities, very high risk. They expect you to be following the guidelines to the T. There is a high risk category where those are other healthcare locations, perhaps. Those could be even meatpacking facilities where we have large numbers of people that cannot socially distance effectively. And if you've been in a meatpacking facility recently, they are also following the guidelines extensively. And then we have a medium risk and then a low risk. And so your response is going to be based on which category you fall into. But if you are in those upper risk categories, man, there is no lenience. I would say that they expect you to follow the guidelines to the T. If that means, like, one of the things they suggested in meatpacking was slow down the lines, only use half a shift at a time. I mean, some incredibly dramatic expectations from a business standpoint. Most of them have had to do workarounds to try to accommodate that, but they're those expectations are very high.
Well, and that's great feedback. The next question actually kind of piggybacked on the COVID-19. So when you talk about the COVID-19 emergency temporary standards you were referring to earlier, the question is, will it take any length of time after the 20th of January to get those in place and begin enforcement?
Yes.
kind of with the idea that, you know, vaccines could be beginning to start to have their impact on the virus as well. So
Yes, hopefully so. That's a great question. That's a very knowledgeable question. Whoever asked that probably has been involved in this.
Rodney, I'll give Rodney Strange credit.
Oh, Rodney. Hey, man, it's good to see you. I'm glad you put your screen up. It's good to see you, buddy. That is a great question. And yes, there is always a buffer period. So even if they roll out this emergency temporary standard, and please don't quote me on this because we never did one while I was the 17 years I was with OSHA, to my knowledge. We didn't even do one, but there would be like a 90-day period where you would be allowed, if not up to 6 months. I'm not sure they can afford a 6-month period. That's part of the urgency, is that this is an imminent threat in their opinion. So, but there is notification. There is a notification requirement by OSHA, and there is a period of time, an allowance for you to get up to speed. So I guess that it would be in that 90-day range, probably no longer than that, since it is such an imminent issue. And the question about how will vaccines impact that, man, that is a great question, and I honestly can't even address. I don't know. I don't know what their expectation will be of vaccinations. I'm not sure they can compel vaccinations necessarily, but in the absence of vaccinations, you will probably be held to a higher standard of social distancing and face coverings and things like that.
Yeah, so we'll hang on here until the top of the hour. Any other questions that you may have? As I mentioned, this webinar brought to you by the Encore Safety Network, and we're going to be following this for the members of the network, certainly, and doing some ongoing content around the changes in the Biden administration. So if that's something you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to us. We can walk you through that in a little bit more detail. But we definitely wanted to make sure that this was available to as many people as possible today. So our contact information for additional questions will be available in the follow-up to the webinar. And then I think, as Alex mentioned, we are recording this and we'll be getting it out to everybody as well. So, but again, like I said, we'll stay on for a few minutes here, and any other questions that you may have, and feel free to unmute if you'd like to talk through them that way, or post them in the comments section, and we'll certainly get to them.
Well, like Elliot said, I will try to stay apprised on the changes if we are seeing changes, and hopefully we can post those or get those distributed. One of the things that I think is incredibly valuable in a network like this, if you have some interaction with OSHA, or if you have, if you are doing something that you think is working effectively and would be willing to share that throughout this network, I just think that is invaluable. You know, it would be great to hear your experiences. If you're hearing from OSHA through that rapid response initiative, you've had an amputation, or they've contacted you with a complaint or something, I would just love to get some feedback how that is going and what the interaction is like, so that we can share that. And I think that will help us in our preparations as well.
All right, well, yeah, I think that we'll wrap up, and appreciate everybody's time. We will, like we said, we'll get the recording out. We'll have some highlight videos, stuff like that we'll make sure to get out to everybody. So have a great rest of the day. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.